Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the very new episode of SETA Techtalks. I am Associate Professor Dr. Erman Akıllı.
And I am Gloria Shkurti Özdemir. Today we are together in our fifth episode of SETA Techtalks, where we are going to focus a little bit more on the digital diplomacy. We have been talking a lot about the technology in general, the technology in Turkey, but today we are going to make a connection between technology and international affairs. So today we have an esteemed professor, Professor Corneliu Bjola, with us from University of Oxford, and we will go into more details about the digital diplomacy and international affairs.
Without further ado, I would like to give a brief information about Professor Bjola's CV. Corneliu Bjola received his PhD in political science from the University of Toronto and has previously taught and conducted research at McMaster University and University of Toronto as well. He was a research fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and a visiting fellow at the Australian Defence Force Academy and China Foreign Affairs University. His current research interests relate to the impact of digital technology on the conduct of diplomacy, with a focus on strategic communication and digital influence, as well as on theories and methods for countering disinformation and propaganda. He has authored articles and edited books primarily focused on digital diplomacy, published by esteemed publishers such as the Oxford Handbook of Digital Diplomacy and Digital International Relations, Technology Agency, and Order by Routledge. Moreover, he is the recipient of the 2014 Ox Talent Award for enhancing students' learning experience using social media apps, awarded by the Oxford Committee on Teaching and Learning Enhanced with Technology. Currently, Professor Bjola is serving as a professor in the Department of International Development at Oxford University. Before starting, I also would like to thank again to Corneliu for accepting our request and being our guest here today at the fifth episode of SETA Techtalks. It's a great pleasure to have you here because he is the most significant person in the field of digital diplomacy. Now, let's start with the first question. Dear Corneliu, digital platforms have transformed diplomacy, altering how state and non-state actors communicate and negotiate. Based on your research and your insights, how do you foresee the digital diplomacy in the evolving situation in the next decade? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Erman. Thank you very much, Gloria, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and congratulations again, for starting the series on Tech Talks. And I hope you'll have a lot of success, both regionally, right, nationally in Turkey, but also more regionally. This is a topic that I think has started to be followed by many in the past 10, 15 years. And as you pointed out in your question, I think this is an evolving field. And we have to ask ourselves why. So we talk nowadays about digital diplomacy. As a term as such, it didn't exist 10, 15 years ago, right? It is something that has started to develop quite fast. And I was part of this academic journey as well. And we have to ask why and where is it going? And I think the short answer, especially when we discuss issues of diplomacy, is that things change, things happen because of certain shocks. There's Ministry of Foreign Affairs are rather, let's say, conservative in their approach. They don't like change too much. And there is a good reason why diplomacy needs to take change with a grain of salt, so to speak, because you need tested change. Change that is reliable, change that, is not only something that is fashionable nowadays and then we jump on it. So Ministry of Foreign Affairs have this kind of inbuilt tendency to look at change with a skeptical eye. But when, pressure is enough, then things started to move. And this is what has happened actually in the past 10 years. We have a series of shocks that push Ministry of Foreign Affairs to embrace technology. Let's start, for instance, with the Arab Spring. That was the first one. a big one. It doesn't. Ministry of Foreign Affairs used to have a presence on social media before 2010, but it was more experimental. People look at it, what is this? This is not real diplomacy, But then in Arab Spring, something happened. Many people realize that what happens online doesn't stay online. And if you want to understand what is going on, you need to listen to this new medium in which people converse, and then there is this kind of contagion that then crosses, the border into the physical world, and then you have, very important events. So this is basically the moment when digital diplomacy, because of this first shock, started to have to go professional. Meaning what? Meaning Ministry of Foreign Affairs go professional when they develop training programs, when they develop strategies, when there is, a particular program to pursue. So that was one shock. And then around 2014, 2016, a second shock. It was disinformation, the dark side. It changed completely the view. While Arab Spring was this kind of optimistic period when, okay, this is, how digital is going to empower democratic regimes and so on. Well, 2014, 2016, you have with ISIS first, and then, a lot of state-sponsored propaganda forced Ministry of Foreign Affairs to take into account also the dark side of digital diplomacy. Another shock, pandemic. And then all of a sudden, you have to move what it used to be in-person diplomacy and everything. You have to transform yourself overnight and to use the type of platforms that are we using right now. And it continued, right? So what the point I'm making here is that, we see this kind of adoption of diplomacy as a result of various pressures coming from various events. So then the question that you ask, where are we going? What kind of shocks, I will say, are we going to see? But there is another problem, I think, with digital diplomacy nowadays, is that it has started to multiply. It started to have kids and nephews and relatives. So you start with digital diplomacy, and then you have cyber diplomacy, and then you have, data diplomacy. Now there is also something that I know that Erman is working. I'm working. I have some publication in the works on metaverse diplomacy. So it started to diversify, and there is a question for many: what's this big family? Tech diplomacy, by the way, right? Another big. So what is going on in this family? What is it fragmented? It is how to hold this together. And I think in order to understand a little bit, these elements of how things are, is that this family is evolving, but there are different drivers. For a long period, we have information was the driver of digital diplomacy in terms of social media, in terms of data, hence the idea of data diplomacy. But then we have also the digital infrastructures that back up everything, right? Hence, the discussion about Huawei or, the 5G technologies. So digital infrastructure is a big discussion nowadays because it touches on many aspects. Cyber diplomacy is a big part of that element of the digital infrastructure. And then there is something else that we see nowadays, especially in the context of tech diplomacy, the issue of governance emerging as well. So what we see in this kind of evolution is that it's not only about information, the first stage of digital diplomacy. We also question about infrastructure that needs to be debated and discussed. And of course, the question about governance that is coming up. And big part of this, speaking about future, is of course a question of the next stage, which is, as we know, AI. This is going to put everything in a totally different perspective. And even, if I may say, and I have a special issue on that with this title because I like the title, may put an end to diplomacy as we know it, in the sense that we're going to have more artificial intelligent entities involved. I'm not saying that the human diplomat will disappear, but it's going to, if we come back to discuss this topic in 10 years, I think we'll be both surprised, all three surprised of how diplomacy may look in the AI age. So short answer to this, I think in terms of evolving, we have to pay attention to the drivers. These drivers come usually through shocks, and also, to reflect on what exactly these drivers are about: information, digital infrastructures, and of course now a big thing, it's about tech governance.
So Corneliu, we talked a little bit about misinformation, and we talked about artificial intelligence. So the thing that comes to my mind right away are about the challenges that we are going to face on the next stage regarding the digital diplomacy. So even in your works, you have been talking about these challenges, and that the policymakers or the diplomats themselves are facing and may be facing in the future. So what are some of the main challenges that the policymakers and the diplomats will face in the future, and how we can handle them?
No, thank you very much for the question. And I think it's an important one. And if you talk with practitioners, that comes first in their mind, how to adapt. So initially, when going back to 2010, I said, well, maybe it would be like the telegraph or the email. Okay, it will be there like a tool, but now it's becoming more present in the way in which diplomats work. So the question is, what kind of, so I'll prefer to break, the question of challenges in different layers. There is a micro level challenge and the macro level challenge. The macro level, I think it's about how Ministry of Foreign Affairs try to make sense of these new technologies in a way that actually supports their foreign policy objectives. So, for instance, talking about AI, where is the interest nowadays? We want to understand not only how to do this kind of more routinized task, consular affairs, because that's easy to be done, but the more challenging one is how to use AI for public diplomacy, how to use AI for international negotiations, how to use AI for crisis management. This is where the interest is at the moment, how to make use of this to enhance. And there is a reason, a good reasons, because the fuel that keeps it is data, and data it's tremendous in terms of the volume and also the speed. So making sense of what is happening, you need this kind of power of technology that can help and be some interest. I mean, we can talk about each of them. How crisis management or international negotiation, how AI could transform this. But these are what I like to call the micro level type of challenges. The same way in which Ministry of Foreign Affairs learned to use social media to communicate and to promote certain type of agenda, I think it's also now for them important to understand the benefits and also the risks that may come from applying this kind of new technologies, especially AI, in the areas that I mentioned. But the bigger challenge, and this is where we go into the issue of governance, the macro level, is digital international order. Right? I mean, we talk about international order traditionally in diplomacy, in this kind of big game of geopolitics with great powers veering for influence and so on and so forth. Somewhere in the middle of this, as we know from 1945, in this picture of international order, we have international organizations. Later, we started to have, non-state actors and so on and so forth. And there is this kind of discussion. What kind of analog, what kind of physical type of international order we had. But another interesting question with these technologies is what kind of digital international order are we going in direction? And this is the topic of one of the books that Erman mentioned, digital international relations, because we try to look exactly at this topic, the question of digital international. It's a concept that people don't necessarily think intuitively, immediately about it. But in the same way, but why do we need to this? Because technology is power. So when we talk about international order in the past, we used to have different type of great powers, right? The ones that used to have, great armies, and then the ones that used to have great navies, and the one that used to have, very good at industrial revolution, and then, and so on and so forth. Technology is also power, a lot of power. And that's
but still also the cases that you provided are still related to technology somehow, like when you become successful in the industrial revolution, for example, applying it or taking all advantages of it, like you use the technology here, which brings to what you said, like technology is power as well.
Yeah, but it's changing a little bit. There is a little bit of clash that we see with the digital international order and traditional order, which is they overlap but not completely. Let me give you an example. For instance, when the social media arrived, the ones that were very keen to use it were middle-sized countries or small-sized countries. Why? Because all of a sudden they could punch diplomatically above their weight. The Scandinavians, Turkey, Israel, Australia, this kind. And the others are big anyway, right? I mean, they have influence. But there was, when I look, for instance, at the metaverse nowadays, and I know Erman is looking at that as well. Well, who is a pioneer in the metaverse? It's UAE, it's Saudi Arabia, it's Korea, right? Totally different type of actors.
Exactly.
Well, I'm not saying that they will become, but there is this kind of diffusion of power, and we have to understand how it works. Yeah, sorry.
No, I was just supporting you, and I was thinking that we are talking about indeed a rebalancing of power, indeed, like a change in the international order that we know right now, and it's just a result of this technological innovation, indeed.
Exactly. And to throw another thing into the mix, if you read, Jan Bremer's article, we might be actually in a technopolar moment. What he meant by that in the article in Foreign Affairs is that power, which is now rebalancing, as you pointed, right? Actually, you may see companies becoming like sovereign entities. That's his argument. And I found an interesting one, right? In which basically companies acquire this kind of power. In the Digital International Relations book, we'll have a chapter on not only on companies, but on individuals. Individuals becoming very powerful. Some of them, Elon Musk, for instance, is more powerful than many countries together because of technology. Because of his mini satellites in Ukraine, because of his power to, Twitter, X, and so on.
Maybe we may be seeing this kind of figures in the future, sitting, for example, in international organizations like United Nations. Maybe in the future, would that be something possible according to you?
There have been proposals, right, to invite some of the tech companies to the UN Security Council. And that's a few years ago. And if I'm not mistaken, Microsoft has opened an office at the UN. And that's an interesting other development, right? Because when we talk about tech diplomacy, we talk about countries reaching out to tech companies. But there is a similar trend happening from the other side. The tech companies are developing this kind of diplomatic services to interact with states. So it's a very interesting moment when we see, and there is a reason for that, right? Why do these countries appoint tech diplomats? Because they recognize power, and power sits in Silicon Valley, in addition to Washington, let's say, right? Sits in Silicon Valley. So where is power? You should basically interact with it. This is how the first stage of institutionalized diplomacy in Italian city-states in the 15th century happened, right? Because you wanted to appoint someone at the court of the sovereign to understand what is going on. It's the same logic nowadays. Where is power? In the hands of these important actors nowadays, whether it's Microsoft, Musk, Amazon, and the others. And of course, on the Chinese side, which is a different type of model. But
Model.
in terms of challenges, these are the two. We have to look at the micro level meaning how this digital technology rechanges or reshapes the way in which Ministry of Foreign Affairs fulfill their traditional functions, right? Public diplomacy or international negotiation crisis. But don't forget about the big picture. And the big picture is less discussed. And I think this is where I think it's very interesting to explore what international order, digital international order means, to what extent it reinforces the analog order or it clashes with it. And if so, what dynamic may result from that? Two different challenges.
Well, I'm really enjoying actually having this conversation. But since you mentioned, I would like to add something. You said that we are actually witnessing a technopolar moment in the international system. I totally agree with you. And actually, I am like describing this moment as we are having the brink of the Westphalia process, actually in the international system, since states are starting to enhance their presence in the digital environment, like in the digital space. So since we are mentioning about this kind of topics, I would like to ask you, most related about your latest book on the Oxford Handbook of Digital Diplomacy, which you have discussed about the digital technologies impact and the practices of that kind of diplomacy. Could you elaborate on a specific case where digital diplomacy significantly influenced the outcome of international negotiation or a conflict resolution? Can you name some?
Yeah, I published a number of articles on this. For instance, on question of international negotiation, remember there was the case of the Iran nuclear deal that was signed by the President Obama at that time. And this was quite interesting is that after negotiation, he has to convince domestically some of the people to support some ratification in the Congress. Not exactly ratification, but approval in the Congress. And they started using a social media account that we use that quite interestingly exactly to counter narratives that were coming from various places to produce support for that. And that ties into this argument of Robert Putnam's argument on the two-level game of negotiations. As we know, the theory of two-level negotiation is that in order to be successful in negotiation, it's not only necessary to convince the other international counterpart, but also to be able to ratify the deal, something that you may remember in Brexit, it was quite difficult to do, to find convergence between the two levels. Where digital interferes is that it makes this process more complicated. On one hand, it facilitates because it allows you to signal positions on social media and so on, but also you make yourself more vulnerable to attempts that try to interfere in your domestic process that tries to negotiate. I also looked at in another chapter after the pandemic. I interviewed a number of diplomats, not only those who use it, generally Zoom during the pandemic, but specifically in a study we found a sample of diplomats who use Zoom for negotiations. Quite an interesting story there. And I asked them, well, is it useful? In what sense do you see that you need to go back to these in-person negotiations to redo that? I said, no. What they've done online, it was perfectly. They were not big, ginormous negotiations, but they were, quite a number of them. What I found interesting with Zoom and the platform, it reshapes the environment in which you negotiate. And actually, Zoom was used occasionally as a tactic to postpone negotiations. So if you don't want the negotiation to continue or to go too fast, Zoom was used as a tactic to delay, right, in a sense. So it has an impact, but not that type of facilitating impact. It has sometimes an impact of trying to invoke technical difficulties or all kind of other lack of confidentiality to delay certain. So you see this remain to these are some examples of when you see the first stage of digital actually interfering. What would be interesting nowadays to see is where the AI could actually help or hinder. And I think this is a very interesting case. I mean, there has been some workshops done on this. AI has tremendous potential to assist with the negotiation. And the reason is clear why. Because, in a negotiation, you go there with a team, you prepare a file, it takes you about a few weeks, maybe longer, to understand the position of the contraparts, to understand your red lines, these kind of things, right? And in principle, AI can facilitate with this kind of conversation. And then you enter into a negotiation, and then Gloria asked me a point, and then I have to go back to my team to see whether that type of provision is acceptable or not. In principle, AI can also interfere into this conversation and suggest me some opportunities. How to do this? This is where the interesting work comes, because you build on a large data set of successful cases of negotiations and try to examine patterns, try to see to what extent those patterns fit with the particular context in which you find yourself, right? So there is potential for AI to become quite effective. The question then will be, if I have a successful tool like this, and then I go into a negotiation with Gloria, who doesn't, how is that going to affect the dynamic? Is Gloria more willing or less willing to enter negotiations with me? Because it knows that I have something that might be quite difficult to beat. Or so we'll introduce a new dynamic, what I'm saying in the negotiations, a new form of digital divide. And that digital divide will make those who actually control power and technology become more powerful in principle than others.
So the gap gets wider then, like between those that have the technology and those that don't have it.
That's, I think, where we are heading now. Comparing with social media was easy. Social media, everybody could open an account, could do things, and it was seen social media more like a level, it's a tool to level the playing field. It didn't cost much.
This may also open the way to more competition, though, at the same time. Even those that don't have it, may try, or may try to enter the competition and try to develop their own technologies just to take advantage of it, though.
Absolutely, it's a race. It's a little bit of a race here, and there is a competition. But also, that raises a question about the digital international order. What to do about this? Because if you start an arm race, right? I have the best tool, you have the other tool. Are we going to see a fragmentation of the digital order? Not order, but different orders, in which, and that's the discussion also connected to technopolar moment. What kind of digital order? Are we going to see a more democratic system type of oriented, or a more authoritarian one, or different islands?
We have the centralized, decentralized systems, and so on.
Maybe.
Yes, indeed. So it comes because of the power, because of the incentives to go alone, right? That this power can give it to you. There is less appetite, for cooperation. And that's an issue. How are we going to deal with it? Kissinger had a book about, can we compare AI with the nuclear technology in the 50s? He made some interesting points that there are some similarities, but a lot of differences in terms of applying the same type of logic to regulating this kind of new technologies. And let's not forget, we are talking about AI in the current form, meaning that we are able, more or less, to control it.
What about a couple of years later, right?
Narrow AI, right? But Facebook announced that they're putting a lot of money into general AI. Well, I'm not sure whether we'll get there very soon, but if you get there, that's another milestone that we're going to see how we're going to deal with it and to cope with it. Because then there will be two species on this planet, both of them intelligent. And I'm not sure which one is going to be the most intelligent, right? I mean, but there are going to be two species on this planet, the humans and the non-humans, in principle. But first we need to discuss, digital order with the current. We'll deal with that later.
Erman Hoca knows me, like I'm generally more like pro technology, but when it comes especially to these kind of discussions, I won't be like, I'm afraid a little bit sometimes, especially when we put it that we'll be two species, just we versus, not versus, but we and artificial intelligence, let's say. So this brings a lot of questions to my mind, and like we're talking about the digital order, international order, and we talked about governance. So there is another issue that's very important in here, and there have been a lot of discussions about this, and we talk about ethical issues, we talk about regulations lately, which have been one of the most important topics, and how issues that especially the governments the nations, the states have been focusing lately. So according to you, like what are the main ethical considerations that the practitioners or the users of this digital diplomacy should keep in mind and try to use this technology responsibly?
Thank you for
very difficult. I'm sorry for that.
Well, that's a big, that's a big question, right? And I'll tell you why it's a very important question. Because in order to do ethics, you need to know clearly what you are dealing with in order to discuss, conditions of or the guidelines, Think about, conditions for the ethics of war, right? We have the just war theory, and we have different combinations. Hugo Grotius was one who grandfather of the just war theory, talking about just cause, right intention, proportionality, things that are, last resort, things that are still relevant. But it was in a particular context in which they knew what word meant and what to do about it. Now, the problems with the new technologies is that we have a rough idea of how things may work. And this is where the battle is at the moment. The battle is not necessarily on ethics. The battle is about on two levels. One is to understand the risk of the new technology, and even more interestingly, is to develop a common language, vocabulary about this risk. The example that I have in mind is the Trade and Technology Council that was established between the European Union and the United States. They had 4 meetings so far. And it's very much focused on technology and how it may affect transatlantic relations. Some people even looked at it as a precursor of a digital NATO. Well, we'll see. But for instance, one of the last meeting was in April, but the one before in Stockholm last year, they convened to organize some working groups, expert working groups on AI. And what was the mission of those working groups? To develop a common language to define risk of AI. Because the Europeans have a different threshold for risk. Americans have a lower threshold, a higher threshold.
Lower,
right? In terms of. And they say, well, we have to understand this, because if we don't have the same language, we don't have similar ethical guidelines. This is, for instance, the European AI Act. That was passed. They come up with 6 different types of risk. And for each risk, then they develop guidelines. So the battle here, if we talk about ethics, is that we have to understand, the risk. Here comes also another issue. That the moment when you define the risk, technology is not static. And one of the problems with technology, especially with AI, is that it continues to evolve. While we define today AI, if we come back in 5 years, we'll find it 5 years ago.
It's changing every month, so it's difficult. Even AI Act had to be changed during the procedure, like before it was voting. So
and
it had
once
to be
it changes, the definition of risk changes, and the necessity for ethical guidelines will change as well. So this is the speed of the transformation that scares many people in terms of being able to stay tuned. I don't want to intimidate them. You are humans. We've gone through different periods of tremendous change in international affairs, and we adapted, sometimes very badly, a lot of conflict. But this is something that we have to keep in mind. So ethics, what ethics means, it's about how to deal with risk, but risk are changing because of the evolving nature of the technology. So that's one thing. Imagine, for instance, if this technology, everybody talks about it as the next stage, which is quantum computing, comes along. Then everything that we know about, decryption, it's out, right? How are we going to deal with quantum computing in that case, right? And there is, from decryption affects everything, affects your financial records, affects our conversation today, right? Affects codes to nuclear weapons. And if you combine quantum AI, you'll have a totally different definition.
Different world, yeah.
At this point, I would like to ask the million-dollar question. I knew that you are mentioning about the AI's amazing evolvement, like an living organism that, like, day by day, like month to month, it evolves and adapts for the new conditions. So we also need to be adaptive for the new risks to counter. So the million-dollar question is, how do you foresee the artificial intelligence as a shaper for the future of the international relations and diplomacy? It would be like a transformative feature, or would it be disruptive feature? How do you foresee?
Yeah, a great question again. And why do I say so? Because most of the time we look at technology as tools. This is a hammer, and I have a nail, and I do this and do that. And this is, applied also to emails, to facilitate communication, social media, as a tool. But what if we change the paradigm? And the idea of AI is no longer a tool, something that to get things done, but also something that actually is different in terms of, and this is what I think what is missing, a philosophy of AI in the context of diplomacy. Let me explain a little bit better this point. Think about how diplomacy evolved. At the beginning, right, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, first one established by Richelieu, 1626, very much dominated by aristocrats, clergy, and it continued like this for a long time. Then you have a different type of paradigm. Women started to get into the, and even now is not very well, depending on the country, they are not very well promoted. Minorities started to get into the diplomatic service. These are all humans. But how are we going to deal our interaction with AI as humans, as diplomats? Are we going to look at it? There is some arguments, and I heard some interesting arguments that sometimes, especially as AI evolves and becomes more sophisticated, we may get to the point in which we have to make room in our cognitive room to understand our relationship with AI. If you go now to one of the AI softwares as an exercise and ask one of them, give me a draft of a convention for AI rights. Akıllı did it, some time ago, and you got a 10-point, very nice draft for international, treaty. And one of them was 1 point was first right for AI: don't delete an AI without its permission.
Wow.
Well, these are interesting elements, right? So I think there are two schools of thought here when you talk about where are we going with AI in diplomacy. For many, 90%, they look at AI as a tool, and I think there is reason, given the state of AI and technology at the moment, to look at it. We're going to use it to understand, for instance, in a crisis, what seems to be the signs of trouble, where is trouble likely to be, how to deal with that. Tool. But may come a moment, mind you, when the tool paradigm will not be enough. In the same way in which you make room in diplomacy for other types of partners, right? We have to think about how AI will become, a way in which we can collaborate. And the area in which I see this happening actually quite fast, it's in the metaverse. Because in the metaverse, you have already holograms, you have all kinds of avatars. Yesterday, I noticed, for instance, even Ukraine has going to launch an avatar, a spokesperson, and they already developed that a little bit. So the tendency for avatar definition and this kind of AI-powered diplomats to operate in the metaverse, this is where I see that the tool paradigm becoming less relevant. And the second paradigm, which I don't have a definition because we don't have yet a philosophy of AI in that context, maybe something to be worked out, will become more interesting.
Thank you very much, Professor. It has been such an enlightening discussion, and I really loved every piece of it. And thank you very much for sharing all of this knowledge with us.
Exactly.
Before closing our discussion, and I'm sorry for making you talk so much because it's been like more than 40 minutes that we've been discussing here. But there is one last question that we generally ask to all of our participants. We want to take advantage a little bit of your experience, to tell the truth. So in here, there are a lot of young students or professionals that have studied international relations and are working on diplomacy and so on. So from your perspective, from your experience, what kind of skills and knowledge should they focus on acquiring during this transformative period of our world?
No, first of all, don't need to apologize. It's my pleasure to have this kind of book. It's an opportunity for me to express some ideas and also, pick up some of the comments that you make and to develop them further. So it's always useful for me to have this kind of conversation. The second point is what kind of skills. Usually people say, well, you need to learn coding, you need to learn mathematics, and I think that's all good, no question about it. But I think we need also the bigger picture. I found myself personally in the past, since I started to think more seriously about AI and diplomacy, I started to read curiously in the past 6 months, and I read a lot nowadays, books from humanities. I want to understand how people dealt with change in the past, how ideas came along. I have a book about the Renaissance period in Italy that I'm reading right now. I found it fascinating how people started to change paradigms. Why so? How did they make room? What was the point of resistance? What role culture had in that? What role religion or philosophy played in that? So humanities, I think, they're sometimes seen as the Cinderella of social sciences, or I think they are coming back because we need to reflect not only on the technical, the machine part of this transformation, but also of how this transformation is affecting us individually, affecting us as a community, affecting us as a society. And I think there are great moments in each. So going back a little bit, to humanities, literature, good literature, and I think it's more about the evolution of ideas. And that's my problem with the tool paradigm. It's very sterile. It's very mechanic, and the ideas, how ideas develop and how do they connect with each other. I think there's a lot of that. So my advice is, in addition to not. In addition to this kind of technical coding, mathematics, which are very important, you cannot understand AI if you don't get a sense of how it works, the data, the algorithms, how do they come together, what's the difference between, generative AI and the more, the type of tools that are being developed nowadays, how data is being circulated. So all these kind of things, I think it's an important aspect that underpins is also so what type of question. What does it mean, for the bigger picture in terms of individual, in terms of community. And humans, when they have these questions, they go back, as I said, to philosophy, to art, to culture. We shouldn't overlook this. I was very pleased because I'm teaching a course on the metaverse at Oxford here, and we have this Google's, Oculus Meta that we use in the course. I was very pleased in one of them to have one about art. It's amazing in terms of immersive art, and it's very inspiring trying to understand how it transforms not only you in terms of perception, but your ideas. And I think this is what we need a little bit more. But in order to understand digital art, you need to understand classical art. So it's hence my reference to the humanities.
To go back to the roots then.
This will be, this interdisciplinarity that we hope to achieve, right, in our department sometimes.
I'm sorry for interrupting you, but something popped up in my mind right now. Like, I was in a couple of organizations during this weekend, and I realized that people were always emphasizing, like, we need to know how to be a good person. We need to focus on trying to be good, and only this way it will be possible for us to use artificial intelligence for good. And or at least it will be this kind of emotional or rationality of ours that will make the difference between we and artificial intelligence in the future. So at that moment, I started to think that maybe we should need to focus more on kind of this psychological or social roots of ours, like what's a good person and how will being a good person make us being different from the artificial intelligence and the decisions that we both take, for example.
Yeah, I like to listen to a discussion in the panel on these topics, right? Because it brings up all kinds of threats, right? But it's an ethical threat, it's a sociological, sometimes it's a psychological element. That's how to define good. Good has evolved historically in various contexts.
Philosophical as well. I forgot to mention that.
Yeah, absolutely. And our interaction with this technology always changed us. Think about, for instance, a very basic thing that you take for granted nowadays, the watch that you probably had on your hand, on your wrist. There used to be a question at the interviews in Oxford: why do you have a watch? And people say, well, because I need to make sure to be present at the meeting. And well, that's an answer. A more interesting one, because it's about time. And that little thing on your wrist regulated time in the Industrial Revolution completely. You have to wake to go up to work at 9 o'clock until 5, and that type of thing, right? Technology always transformed us in our rhythm, our connections. Where are we going? I mean, we see nowadays a little bit, of this technology changing also the way in which we interact with each other. So we need to dig deeper in the direction that you mentioned, right? What does it mean for us? Is it making us better? Or as you see with the dark side, that you saw with the dark side and the weaponization of technology, actually creating more chaos and transforming people who barely face to face will be very polite to you, but online will be vicious. Anonymity, emotional contagion, all those things that come with that. But I think these kind of debates are essential if we are, in addition to the technical elements that, right? If we focus only on technical, we miss a big picture of how this technology is transforming us and, of course, diplomacy. So thanks for bringing that up.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm very, very glad that I was a part of this program today, and we hope that we may have future collaborations. And thank you for accepting our invitation. Thank you very much.
Many thanks again, for inviting me, and I hope, we're looking forward, to future collaboration. And meanwhile, again, my congratulations for starting and for starting this series on Techtalks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Corneliu. It was a great pleasure to have you here, joining us at the 5th episode of SETA Talks. It is a great honor and pleasure. Thank you again for being here today. I also would like to thank to our viewers to being with us here today at the very episode of SETA Talks. I would like to thank our guests and thank our viewers. And now we are already surpassed our time limit. So with your permission, Cornelia, I would like to close this session. Thank you again for being us here today. Hope to see our viewers at the very next episode of the Techtalks.
Absolutely. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Have a great